Thank you very much indeed for inviting me to take part in this panel. I was not on the agenda originally, but when your organizers decided they wanted to have the British referendum discussed, they concluded, not unreasonably, it would be useful to have a British voice taking part. The one thing I'm not going to be able to do this morning is tell you what the result will be, because this is not the referendum like the one that took place in Crimea. We haven't the faintest idea what the result will be, and it's not a consultative referendum like the Dutch referendum. This is not the British public giving advice to the government. It has been made quite clear this will be taking the decision. And if the British public were to vote for Brexit, to leave the European Union, however small the margin, that is what will happen. And likewise, if they vote to remain, that is what will happen. So it is a hugely important decision. That after 40 years, this is a matter that's being not just considered, but is going to be addressed. And you're entitled to know, well, why is it happening? Why is it that Britain has decided to have this referendum and to have it at this moment in time? I think the important point to stress is this is not a sudden decision. This is not a sudden surge in euroscepticism which has engulfed the United Kingdom. There are two factors to understand. The first is that actually euroscepticism has been a very important part of the British psyche for the whole 40 years we have been a member state. We were not one of the original members of the European community when it was first formed, when 6 countries decided to form the European community. We could have been a member, we declined to join. And when we did join 40 years ago, we had a referendum shortly afterwards to confirm what we had decided. And on that occasion, the British public voted 2-1 in favour of remaining in the European community. So why are we at this question again? It is not just that the country itself has been divided over that period of time. It is that the European community has become the European Union, and the process of integration has gone far further than most people, certainly in the United Kingdom, thought it would go. Most people back in the 1970s in the United Kingdom thought they were joining a common market, a trading organization that would create free trade, single market, but that's what it was about. I'm not saying they were entitled to believe that. Anybody who read the Treaty of Rome, anybody who heard what was happening in any detail, should have understood this was a dynamic process. But what we have seen is not just the Eurozone, but also the process of integration has affected people's daily lives. It's not just trade, it is the way in which the European Court of Justice can force the changes in domestic legislation, the way in which in health and safety, in social policy, some aspects of fiscal policy, and in a whole range of other issues that you'll be familiar with. Now, why is this more of a problem for the United Kingdom than any other country? It is because we actually, by accident of history, we do have a very different history and geography. We happen to be an island on the western extremities of Europe. We've been a very lucky island. We have never been invaded for 1,000 years, since 1066. So we've not had the problems of trying to deal with immediate threats to our security from our neighbors. When we have gone to war, as we did in 1914 and 1939, it was because the balance of power in Europe was changing. There was a threat to Europe because of Hitler or because of the Kaiser, and we wanted to be on the side of those who were trying to prevent that threat developing. But that was a very special situation. And we have also been a fortunate country that we have had a national parliament, a real parliament, ever since our civil war in the 1600s. That's now 400 years ago. We've had uninterrupted, not perfect democracy, it's changed over the years, but we've had a system of parliamentary democracy and the rule of law for 400 years, without a dictator since Oliver Cromwell in the 1600s. And therefore we've got very much used to ruling ourselves. And our concepts of supranationality, sharing sovereignty, a European Parliament, a European Court telling us what laws we can pass. These are challenges for every country in the European Union, But in a sense, many of the continental European countries have had so many other problems to deal with. Democracy is so recent, the rule of law is so modern, that the European Union is seen as a way, and rightly seen, I do not criticize this, it's rightly seen as a way of reinforcing the democracy, the modernization, the rule of law in the countries concerned. The United Kingdom, rightly or wrongly, doesn't feel the need for an external way of developing our democracy, and indeed we are more conscious of what is often called the democratic deficit in the European Union. Because every time a decision is taken that affects the sovereignty of all countries in the European Union, every time a decision is taken by qualified majority voting, which may go against the vote of an elected government in any one country, quite difficult to explain to your own people why a law is being imposed upon them that was not approved by their own parliament, might have been opposed by their own government, but they were outvoted in the European context. Now, we recognize that these aren't the only arguments. If it was as simple as that, then we should never have been in the European Union in the first place. Let me tell you where I'm coming from as an individual. I'm not a member of a government. When I was foreign minister, I was described in Le Monde, the French newspaper, as a eurosceptic modéré, the important word being modéré. And I will vote for the United Kingdom to remain in the European Union. I've no doubt about it. Why will I do that, despite all the points that I have been mentioning? I will do it essentially for two reasons. First of all, we are no longer the British Empire. The world is increasingly a global world where many of the fundamental decisions will be taken by the United States, by China, by Russia, by India, by the European Union, with or without us. And as a country of only 65 million, roughly the same size as France, a little smaller than Germany, as an individual country, we recognize that we will not be able to influence these global decisions, but as part of the European Union, we have a comparable opportunity to make a major impact on the matters that affect the whole of the planet we live in. But there's also a secondary reason, what is of crucial importance to us as a free market, open trading country. There has never been a debate in Britain for 100 years about free trade, about the removal of economic barriers. We had that debate in the 19th century, and those who wanted protectionism, closed borders, lost that debate, and it's never re-emerged in Britain. So it's not even an issue, unlike in France, for example, where it remains a very real issue. And I worked under Margaret Thatcher. I was in her government. I was her Europe minister for several years. And she, almost as much as anyone, strongly disagree with my fellow citizens who want Britain to leave, is that most of them say, well, if we did vote to leave, we would then need to negotiate with the European Union to have continued access to the single market, rather like Norway or Switzerland, other countries outside the EU have. And that seems to me a completely pointless exercise, because it means that rather than being involved in the decisions within the European Union as to what the single market should consist of, we would have to accept decisions made by others without any involvement in these decisions in order to have continuing access to the trade and services that go with it. So it seems to me that is something well worth doing. The final point I want to make, I don't want to speak too long, and forgive me if I am, but just a couple of final points. What also influences me is that the European Union itself has dramatically changed. And it's changed not because the governments necessarily wanted it to, but because two reasons. Euroscepticism is not just a British phenomenon. It now exists throughout most of Europe. In the Netherlands, where the Netherlands Prime Minister said the days of ever closer union are behind us. In France, in Germany, in most other European countries, there are very strong forces saying we must not sacrifice too much national sovereignty while preserving a European Union, but it must be done in a way that gets the balance right. I believe that actually Europe now is moving to where the balance will be much more satisfactory. And it's not a two-speed Europe. So often I've heard people in Brussels saying, okay, we accept there is a two-speed Europe. But a two-speed Europe means you all end up at the same destination, but some take longer to get there than others. It's not like that. At the moment, out of 28 members, there's only, I think, 15 or 16 in the Eurozone. Of those that are not, there are countries like Britain, Sweden, Denmark, who don't want to be in the Eurozone, although they could easily be if they chose to do so. There are other countries that would like to be there, but will not meet the conditions for many years to come, and that doesn't even begin to include potential new members from the Balkans and elsewhere. So this isn't two-speed. For the rest of our lifetime, the lifetime of everyone in this room, there will be different kinds of members of the European Union. And it's not just the Eurozone. 2 countries are not in Schengen. 4 countries are not members of NATO, while the remainder are members of NATO. And there's other opt-outs that individual countries have. So what we now have, and which I as a British citizen am much more comfortable with, is a European Union that's not trying to pretend to be the United States. It's not trying to pretend to itself that with 28 countries with different languages and cultures and so forth, that they can somehow, even if it's over a generation, create some European supranational identity that, if it's not a state, is much closer to one. There is a recognition that that's not Europe's destiny, and that we should relish the diversity that Europe enjoys. So we should work together on foreign policy, on the single market, on trade, on environmental issues that don't recognize national borders, perhaps on energy policy, and a range of other issues. But pretty well everything else should increasingly be for national elected governments, democratically answerable to their own public, to consider and decide for themselves. We should not be in a situation where a European country in the European Union may have less autonomy than California or Texas or New York have to determine their own domestic circumstances. Very final point is, I said I couldn't tell you what the result of the referendum in Britain will be. I think it will be to remain in. At the moment, the opinion polls are fairly evenly balanced, but that's misleading. At least I think it's misleading, because at the moment they are just that, they are opinion polls. People being asked not for certain what they're going to vote, but what they feel at this moment in time, 2 months before the referendum. And anyone who has any irritation with the European Union, and that's most people, are more likely to say, oh, I would like to get out of the organization and leave. As we get closer to the day itself, I think what is most likely is, because the British are very cautious people, if we were voting to join the EU for the first time, we might very well vote no. But we've been in the EU for 40 years. To leave would be a leap into the unknown. Even those who want that conclusion don't actually know what it would lead to, cannot give answers as to what our arrangements would be thereafter. And we have a saying in Britain, perhaps you should stick with your nurse for fear of something worse. It's not a bad bit of advice, and that's the most likely outcome in my view.
So Malcolm, thank you very much indeed.